What's up, YouTube? As you can tell, I'm not sleep deprived. You're sleep deprived. Stop judging me. But besides that, welcome back to another Dimir Shadow video. Trying out this Coach Pingu list again. Again, the only change that we made, we posted a video yesterday or the day before with this list, first run of it, and ended up trophying that league. So if you want to check that out, it's I think the last Dimir Shadow video. But the only change that we made from the original list was swapping out the second Inquisition of Kozilek for a third copy of Counterspell. Everything else is the exact same as the original list. But this is the second league that we ran through. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe if you are enjoying the content, enjoying the commentary, and enjoying some sweet Death Shadow action. So let's go ahead and hop into I guess we'll go over the list real quick in case you didn't see the video yesterday. So this is a list I got tagged in on Twitter that I decided to run through a few paces. Feels a little bit more like an older Death Shadow list with the 4 Thought Scour, 4 Murktide, 17 lands. There's 4 Orcish Bowmasters in here, 3 Counterspell, 4 Drown and Lock. Drown being a little bit easier to enable with 4 copies of Thought Scour in the main deck. And then 4 Thoughtseize, 4 Fatal Push, 4 Consider, 4 1-mana counters, the 3 Stub, 1 Pierce, 4 Bowmaster, 4 Drown, 4 Murktide, whole bunch of 4-ofs. And then this really cool sideboard juke. I actually really like these 4 Dolthy in the sideboard. I mentioned it yesterday that they're kind of like your fill-in cards. For example, if you play against a matchup where Fatal Push is dead, say a Charbelcher or a blue-white control or whatever, you can just swap those pushes straight out for Dolthy. Or if you're against a matchup where, I don't know, maybe Bowmaster is bad, you can swap out those. Drowning Lock's bad, swap out for Dolthy. And you just have a really easy trade in and out on those slots. So let's go ahead and hop into the matches so we can kind of showcase there. But I do think the list is pretty cool. If I think it's better or worse than anything we've been doing, I'm not really sure yet. But at the very least, I think the list is warranted further testing, if that makes sense. So we got a mold of 6 here. We did keep a 3-lander and found the 4th immediately, which is a little Not a big fan of that. But maybe we can find some threats or find something to do with our mana. Gonna go ahead and pass with this stub up. Looks like we're up against a 4-color pile deck, so maybe soft stubbing it to Fairy is something we get to do, or in this case, soft stub a Wrenn. It's a pretty good chance that they have the follow-up land, which they did, but I can't just let a Wrenn sit around. I thought about just playing out 1 Shadow in case of a removal spell, but if they have Solitude, I'm not lowering my life anymore anyway, so stopping them from killing a Shadow and wiping out the second isn't really that big of a deal if I don't have a way to get the second on the battlefield in the first place. So I'm just going to play under the assumption that maybe they don't have the Solitude. And yeah, they in fact did have the Solitude. So there's that. So this is one of those examples of matchups where the 4 Dolthy for 4 Fatal Push comes in handy, just straight up swapping those out. And then bringing in a couple copies of Turok. Usually Turok, Spreading Seas, something like that. Subtlety is okay here. Force of Negation's okay. It kind of depends on how much you see yourself needing to aggressively tap out for threats. So for example, here I want to curve out these Dolthys So I need to be able to hold up force negation on my opponent's turn for like Renin 6 or Teferi, whatever the case may be. Like here, I don't want a Teferi resolving. I think stopping a Teferi is more important than resolving a Dolthy. So as soon as I see that they go for a prismatic ending instead of Teferi, which I believe if they had Teferi, they'd just go for that. But as soon as I see they don't have that, I'm just slamming Dolthys. Dolthy tribal over here. It's a little saddening because I'm pretty sure I already used my Dolthy thumbnail. This would have been a good one for it. I did use my Dolthy thumbnail. So I have like a backlog going of I probably have 7 or 8 like testing league videos that I've already done that are kind of around in case nothing new shows up. It's like if something new like this Dimir list shows up, we want to do a video on that or a couple videos on that, kind of showing it off. But whenever nothing new's coming around, we got like a backlog of test videos. So I got to make thumbnails for the YouTube videos for these backlogs. And I'm not gonna lie, it's difficult to come up with some unique cards here and there to do thumbnails of, because I like mine to have some personality. I don't want them to be like monotonous. So this hand does have a lot of pop to it with like the subtlety, Murktide, Turok. We need to hit a couple more lands for Turok, but we at least have a lot of really good threats. Now one less threat. I'm probably supposed to just go ahead and scour here. Like, I need to find a land, and if I had scoured on my main phase, I would have found that, and maybe been able to untap and kick Turok. So I think that was pretty bad on my part. Also, should have just kicked Turok right there. Like, I'm not holding up mana for any reason. The mana doesn't matter. But then again, them having a ring going means that Turok really doesn't matter either, right? I've been seeing more and more arguments on like Twitter and Reddit and stuff going back and forth about banning or not banning the One Ring. And my personal opinion is this card is 100% going to get banned. And the reason being is not so much that the card by itself is just so ungodly broken that they have no choice to ban it. But it's just like the culmination of the fact that any land getting to 4 mana halfway reliably can just jam 4 of them in, and it single-handedly wins games. But as far as like 4-color goes, or like 4 or 5-color Omnath piles go, the ring is just a filler for any top-end card that could be in that list. So you've got 4 copies of the ring, which is horrible to play against, but at the same time, the rest of your deck just being like Leyline Binding, Teferi, Renin 6, Omnath, all these other cards that are easily worthy of a ban by themselves, just means that the ring could have been literally anything at that top end, and it would have been problematic. So we're up against creativity here. Kind of figured that out when they went Jetmir Garden into Steam Vents on a couple of red or on a red fetch. So you start noticing like all their lands are mountains. So I'm going to get down these shadows and this Murktide. If my opponent wants to attack in and like creativity, their token, their treasure token, then I can possibly just present lethal on the crackback. So transmogrify, ditch a shadow because now I have like a lethal shadow on the ground with or not a lethal shadow on the ground, but lethal with the Murktide. So I just force the chump with the Archon. In this case, get down another Murktide, which my first Murktide wasn't lethal. Even if I play the first or the second Murktide first, which means I can just chump the Murktide and nothing really changes. So I'll just make them give the block without revealing any information first. But either way, we present enough threats to be able to go to game 2. Another one of those fatal push being kind of bad matchups. Since Dolthy does do some work against like Wrenn and 6, against Persist, things like that, it's not too bad. Take a drown. Definitely a very reactive hand at the moment. Would have loved to have found like a 3-mana spell to pierce or stub right there, just like a Teferi, Fable of the Mirror Breaker, something like that. Go for Spreading Seas on a Garden. If they do counter this, I can fight back over this reprieve pretty safely because they cannot untap and have a Dwarven Mine make a token. So I kind of got myself a little bit of a turn off to develop my mana a little more, maybe find another threat. If opponent wants to like Leyline Binding my Spreading Seas like this, that's completely fine. Like now I'm back to having all my mana open, so I don't really care if they go for a creativity at this point. All right, so we find a threat. We find a Thoughtseize. So now we have the mana to go like Thoughtseize into Shadow, or in this case, protect Thoughtseize. Still Shadow, hold up Spell Pierce. As we see, they didn't have a second green mana, so they couldn't Veil again. But we have the Spell Pierce to hopefully fight over creativity off the top. But opponent decides they're not about it. They want to move on, do other things. All right. On the draw against Esper Sentinel. A little bit of a slow hand. Like maybe this Bowmaster gets to shoot down a Sentinel, but if this is Hammertime and they have like Sigarda's Aid and a hammer here, then things could get a little awkward. So we see Aid but no hammer, which means I'm probably just going to main phase this Bowmaster and not like risk them untapping, having a hammer, having a Shadow Spear, something like that. Giver of Runes. More like Giver of Gone, am I right? Hit him with the classic 1-2. All right, so Bowmaster being like raise the alarm plus there. The bodies weren't really doing anything, but the ping absolutely did. Game 2, my opponent mulled to Oblivion and scooped. So really nothing exciting to say about that one. As always, in the interest of full disclosure, I include those in the video because, hey, it happens. And at least for our sake, when it does happen, it's part of the testing data. So I want it on record that, hey, I beat Hammertime there. But I also beat Hammertime when they never saw a second land game 1 and Mold to Oblivion and scooped game 2. So, all right. So mono red Kuldotha, Kuldotha, whatever we're calling it. I could fatal push one of these tokens, but if they do end up being Boros and having a convoke guy, I can't drown in the locket anyway because I can't put anything else in their graveyard. So I don't really feel like a lot of pressure to use up this fatal push early. Also, this is like the Orcish Bowmaster matchup. And what I mean by that is I am so positive that Bowmaster does more work against this deck than I've seen it do against any other deck that I run into. And that's because of situations like this where your opponent's got a bunch of 1/1s. They've got blood tokens. They've got Raven Inspector tokens. And a lot of times you can set up like Bowmaster, ping something, the army token blocks something, and then they crack a blood token or crack a clue, draw a card. You get to ping something else, or they crack a canopy land and you ping something. And yeah, it's just the card ends up doing a ton. Like here, they crack a blood token. Cool, I get to ping something and make a 1/1 that's going to get the block. If they crack this bauble, then I get to ping something else. But instead, I'm just going to hit them for 8 in the face and Bowmaster down. So slightly less exciting, but it's also kind of a weird spot against this deck where a lot of the times I want Bowmaster, I want the army token to not get to a 2/2 so I can trade with something and then make a new token next time they block or next time they draw instead of just having one token there. Like going wide is usually going to help out a lot more than going tall in this matchup, at least. So they do have a turn 2 Bushwhacker, turn 3 Blood Moon, but they don't have like the Kuldotha. They don't have a bunch of tokens, anything going wide. So feels a little bit better. We've got one unknown card in hand. I've got a Shadow and a Drought of the Lock, and they're adding Giganta to their hand. So, you know, as soon as you see your opponent adding Giganta to your hand, you feel a little bit better. Especially when you just have like a 2-turn clock. Definitely a 2-turn clock now. So counter the Giganta, and we kill them on the next turn because they draw a card off Bobble. Orcish Bowmaster pings them, and then we get to attack in for lethal. So I think we're 3-1 going into match 5 here. Reasonable hand on the play. We've got like Spell Pierce on turn 1, Bowmaster on turn 2 if they have something like Ragavan. Find a fatal push, but I'm more inclined to just Bowmaster. Doing it main phase because I don't want to run into like a counter spell. All right, so Fury, evoke off of a Ragavan, dash a third Ragavan, which we see another Ragavan, expressive iteration. We have to take the Murktide. So, like, I'm thinking I'm up against blue-red Murk, just straight up blue-red Murktide, but Fury in the main deck is kind of throwing me off here. That's not one you usually expect to see in the main deck, but I guess it's not the craziest thing in the world. Like, this deck also plays Blood Moon in the main a reasonable amount of the time. And then top decking Murktide here, I think, kind of seals the deal. Like, opponent ends up scooping it up here, but yeah. Murktide off the top, living through an unholy heat. We've got Fatal Push for Ragavan or Ledger Shredder, Darcy, whatever the case may be. Going to game 2, board out some of the hand disruptions, some drowns, board in a couple Dolthies on the draw. Good board in Turok, but a little bit worse on the draw. So Rag on 1, Dash or Rag on 2. I do want to mention Ledger Shredder. I mentioned it in the video. All right, so that Thoughtseize, let's pause. Let's slow the roll there. Thoughtseize sees slip out the back, Essence Flux, Murktide, Fury, Ragavan. So now we know we're against Blue-Red Scam. We're not up against Blue-Red Murktide. Which it is kind of cool to see that their deck just has like those Murktide openings of, hey, Ragavan, Counterspell, Expressive Iteration, Murktide. So that's really cool. But this is like likely to play out a lot different than Blue-Red Murktide is, just because you do have to be wary of just a big Fury coming down for 1 or something like that. But I did want to mention Ledger Shredder. I do think this card is a lot better right now than people are giving it credit for, because it kind of negates. I think people were under the assumption that Ledger Shredder was going to be like dead because of Bowmaster, or Bowmaster was going to be great because Ledger Shredder was fairly popular. But I think Ledger Shredder is actually a pretty decent counter to Bowmaster, because if you're drawing, there's a good chance like the ping to you doesn't matter. So if you're not putting yourself in a position where the pings are killing off creatures, like just having Ragavan sitting around or Darcy's on 1 or whatever, then the pings don't really matter. And if you're able to discard live stuff or non-land permanents or non-land spells, whatever the case is, then Ledger Shredder just like outgrows the army token, and being able to fly in over the army is pretty nice. So I just don't think you need to be like writing off Ledger Shredder if it's a card you enjoy casting or want to play more of. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and dress down this Murktide Regent, because I do not want it coming in with a bunch of counters. I know, crazy of me. How dare I? And here we just get to Fatal Push Ledger Shredder, play our Murktide, force a chump with their Murktide, and yeah, opponent scoops it up. So pretty decent showing out of Dimir here. Let's talk about some of the cards, what I thought. Bowmaster looked reasonable there. Had some impressive moments. Murktide, obviously great. I still think I've only Murderous Cut 1 time, but I did have a really sweet line against a mono red opponent, like a mono red Hayashi opponent, where I got a Murktide down is a 7/7. I knew they had I had Thoughtseize them. They had Lightning Bolt, Fury, Flame Slash, Bone Crusher Giant, and like a land. And I think I took the Flame Slash, played out a 7/7 Murktide. My opponent evoked Fury, like drew a red card, evoked Fury, and then went to bolt the Murktide. And I got to respond with Murderous Cut, exile 3 cards out of my yard to kill like a seasoned Pyromancer and grow the Murktide outside of burn range. So like that was really sweet. But other than that, I've only cast Murderous Cut like once, maybe. Just never comes up. So I wonder if that would be better as just another cantrip or something. But I get the idea that, hey, it is pretty nice to have it with Murktide, but Logic Knot could also be pretty sweet if you just want to counterspell in that place instead of um, Murderous Cut. Bowmaster, very reasonable, that league. I still think more often than not, it's like Raise the Alarm plus. Like, Raise the Alarm most of the time with a slight plus that when you get to ping down a creature, it becomes exponentially better, but it's hard to judge the number of times that pinging down a creature actually matters versus just pinging down a creature because you can ping down a creature. So that's like my biggest uncertainty when it comes to Bowmaster is like how much is the Bowmaster effect winning me the game versus the Bowmaster effect just doing something because the card says it does it. Spell Pierce. I'm not really sure I like the Spell Pierce over just the 4th Stubborn Denial. Like, games move so quickly the first few turns that Spell Pierce over Stub doesn't really matter. There's like such a... It's like a 1, maybe 2 turn window around turn 3, 4, sometimes 5, where Spell Pierce being Spell Pierce instead of Stubborn Denial actually matters. It's like this situation where you get to turn 4 and your opponent plays their 4th land and then goes for like a Fable or Teferi or something like that, and you don't have a threat. Those are like the only times that Spell Pierce is better. But then you'll have times where I've got a threat down and my opponent's at 3, 4 lands and they can pay 1 mana for that Leyline Binding. And I'm sitting there looking at a Spell Pierce like, man, I wish you were a Stubborn Denial instead. So I kind of wonder if it's actually worth playing the Spell Pierce over the 4th Stub. The Pierce is a little bit better against like Hammertime, where they're likely to have 2 mana, but 1 mana plays. But against the decks that are curving, like Wrenn 6 on 2, Teferi 3, Ring on 4, something like that, then Stub's probably just as good. Inquisition. I've had Inquisition a couple times now, just completely whiff, especially against like Living End. But I've also had it whiff against a few ring decks where it would just be like Inquisition you, and they reveal Solitude, the Ring, Fury, Omnath, or something, and you're like, well, I know everything I'm dying to. So that's a little bit of a downer. I've also drawn Inquisition against Karuga before, like a Karuga Fires of Invention list, and Inquisition just saw like Leyline Binding, Fires of Invention, Time Walk, something else like Fire and Ice. And I'm just like, kind of sucks. So personally, I wouldn't hate it if you just replaced Inquisition with like Duress. Like, it's dead against Living End a lot of the time, but at least against the Ring, it's fairly live. Or what is it? Despise, I think, hits a creature or a planeswalker. Like, that one would be reasonable. I'll have to double check if that's actually the card. So that could be a potential one. In the sideboard, Subtlety and Force of Negation are reasonable, and I get the usefulness because, like, when you're bringing in all these Dothies and stuff against creature or non-creature matchups, then it can be really nice to be able to just windmill slam like a Dolphy on turn 2, hold up force and negation for their Ren or their Teferi, whatever the case may be, or slam a Murktide on turn 3, have force and negation for their Teferi, for their Ring, subtlety for the Omnath. So that's kind of cool. Force, I think, is pretty rough against a lot of the unfair stuff. So, like Leyline Binding, they can just cast on your turn, and you'd have to pay full retail for Force, in which case Stubborn Denial gets a lot better. Living In can play Violent Outburst on your turn, stuff like that. But I will say I've gotten a lot of mileage out of Force on the draw, being able to tag like an Expedition map out of Tron, a Sigarda's Aid out of Hammertime. There was another big one that I hit not too long ago. A Utopia Sprawl out of Ponza. Like, hitting a couple of those really feels good. So maybe it's just a situation where on the draw, you want to board out like a couple Stubborn Denial or a Spell Pierce, Stubborn Denial, whatever, for a couple Force Negation. And then on the play, bring the Stub and the Pierce back in. But have to kind of experiment around with that, come up with a configuration that works for you, because it might not be the same configuration that works for me. This deck does have a little bit of trouble turning the corner. I've talked about in my Dimir list, I've kind of liked having the Shadow of Mortalities as well as like the Street Wraiths and the Dismembers, because when you need to get aggressive, you have the tools to do so. It kind of becomes, okay, I can Fetch Shock, Thoughtseize, Fetch Shock, Street Wraith, play a Shadow, into your turn, dismember my own Shadow, untap, and just hit you for like 7 or 8 and have Counterspell up. You have that ability. But in this list, even though you have the same number of lands that don't deal damage to you, you've got the Island, the Swamp, the Darkslick Shores, whereas I have 2 islands and an Otawara. Not having the 4 Wraith and the 4 Dismember or the 4 Wraith, the 2 Dismember, is a pretty significant difference in terms of your ability to reduce your life total quickly enough to get the game over with. So a lot of times you do have to play a significantly more controlling game with this than my list. But that's what the testing process is for, seeing what works, what doesn't work, what we want to change, what works for me that might not work for you, what works for you that might not work for me. So other than that, as always, if you're enjoying the commentary, enjoying the content, feel free to drop a like or a subscription. Doesn't cost you anything on YouTube. Just lets you know whenever the new videos go live. We'll have the link to the Twitch channel down below if you ever want to catch a live stream, as well as a link to the Control Freak Discord if you want to come ask questions about this list, any other list, anything Shadow, non-Shadow, whatever the case may be. Also have a link to the Twitter. It's the first place it gets updated whenever a new stream is going live, so you never miss anything. And then finally have a link to the deck list. So if you want to check it out, see kind of what the price is, what card options are there for you, then you can check out that as well. But otherwise, hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day. Stay safe. Enjoy some good food and company. I will catch y'all back live later. Adios for now.